As we read the last chapter of the book of Job, it almost seems as though it's a fairy tale ending to a story that didn't go wrong, did go right. So, for those of us who've been following, and we all have read this story so many times, the first two chapters and the last chapter are kind of in prose form, right? It's a story that's written. And the remaining 40 odd chapters are all poetry about what happens to Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, coming forward and giving him ideas of what may have gone wrong and why are you suffering. And then we have an interesting character named Elihu who comes, who also gives his opinion on the matter. And then finally, God speaks. All of this is poetry. And even amidst all of this, as we come to the end of the story, apart from this fairy tale ending where Job is doubly blessed, we don't really get an answer for why he suffers. We don't really get an answer for why he suffers, apart from God's words in the last few chapters, 38, 39, which are basically rhetorical statements where God says, can you do this? Can you do that? Implying that I am God, right? I do things. But we don't really get an answer of why this guy suffered so much as we read in the first two chapters. Now, before we get into this prose, there have been people who have tried to get an answer to why the righteous suffer, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? Robert Frost, one of famous poets, we know some of his famous lines, but he came up with his own writing, which is called A Mask of Reason, M-A-S-Q-U-E, A Mask of Reason, where he actually attempts at a Job chapter 43. We have only 42 chapters, right? Remember the characters in the first two chapters? We have Job, we have Job's wife, and then we have this interesting character called the Satan, right? And so he brings these three characters together, and it's actually a play that's written, so it's a poetry, where they dialogue with each other and they discuss. Initially it starts off with Job and Job's wife, where Job's wife says, yeah, now it's all fine, but we still don't know why you suffered. And then Satan enters, and then Job's wife asks, why did you do this? And then God enters the picture in this dialogue, right? And Job's wife actually asks God, why did these things happen? Why did you don't give us an answer? And God actually says, according to Robert Frost, I was doing all this just to show off to Satan. Now that could be one way to kind of make sense of this story, right? That he suffered so that his suffering and the end of the story where he's seemingly blessed doubly gives us an understanding of, even though we go through suffering, God will rescue us. God will give us a double portion in that sense. But remember that Job's biggest problem through these chapters with God, or his bone of contention, is not that God was weak and God did not rescue him, but that God had failed to render justice. In some ways, where he speaks, he says that, why have you done these things to me, even though I've been a good person all along, right? His question is about God's justice. Why did you do this to me in spite of me being not so bad? And from that perspective, when we look at this chapter, the reading that we had, there are a couple of concepts that I would like to bring out that might help us to understand this passage. So we see that the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Now we see that the numbers of his stock is also given, right? He gets in verse 12. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, and he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, and 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. Now, if you go back to the first chapter, you will see when Job is introduced that he will basically have half of this, right? So it will basically say 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. Now, number-wise, double, right? It makes sense. But there is a concept in the Hebrew understanding of the double portion. We see that mentioned in a couple of places. The famous one is where Elijah asks for Elisha. The other way around. Elisha, the younger prophet, asks for Elijah, give me a double portion when he leaves, when he passes on, right? What is this double portion? Now, when you look at Deuteronomy chapter, if you want to, you can make a note of it and read it later. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 to 17. Here is where this concept is introduced, where the scripture talks about the inheritance in Hebrew society. Now, inheritance goes naturally to the firstborn and the firstborn male. And we know that, right? We are all part of such cultures as well. Now, interestingly, the firstborn gets not just one portion, but a double portion, while the rest get one portion. Okay. Now, let me just make this clear. For example, let me take my own example. Me, let's say my brother Arun. All of you know he's the older one. And me, let's say my parents are going to give us our inheritance. If we were part of Hebrew society, they would technically give Arun 2/3 and give me 1/3. Right? So that is how it works. It's not that it would make sense if there are 3 kids. Right? The firstborn always gets double of what the others get. So if there were 4, everybody will get one each, but the first one will get 2. So it would be broken off that way. If there were 4 kids, it would be broken off into 5 portions. If there were 5 kids, it would be broken off into 6 portions. Okay, now you're nodding. Now I kind of made that point across. The reason for that, it's not that the firstborn is special. In some ways, maybe yes, but the firstborn has the duty to take care of the ones in the family. Maybe not his immediate family, but those who are in their care, like the people who help in their homes, foreigners, strangers that come into their society, and things like that. Now, where do we see this most clearly? We know the book of Ruth, right? What does Boaz do? He has no reason to marry Ruth, except that he was technically the person in that line who was supposed to be that person with the double portion. And he took it upon himself to marry Ruth. Now, this concept is called kinsman redeemer, or kinsperson redeemer, right? The first person, the eldest in the family, gets this double portion so that you will have enough to care for your own immediate family, but also do your obligation to take care of the others, the vulnerable in the society. Now remember, Job is a very ancient story, right? And Hebrew people are listening to this story. In fact, some of the names, even Job, is not a Hebrew name. Okay, it is a tale that has been passed on, and the Hebrew people are listening to this story. So now in their minds, now as you are made aware, when they come across Job getting double, they are not thinking, look at him, he's being blessed, God is giving him all the things in the world and he's going to enjoy the latter days more than the former days. They immediately understand that God is giving him double so that he has to care for his community. Now, we still don't get an answer for the suffering, but we get a glimpse into the mind of God. So maybe the story of Job is not much about why do the righteous suffer, but a story into who are the poor. And therefore, when you read these last few verses, it blows our mind. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters, which is also mentioned in the beginning, right? But remember, in the beginning, the 7 sons and 3 daughters are killed. But he has the same number of sons and daughters at the end. But here's where it gets better. He named the first Jemimah, the second Keziah, and the third Keren Hapuk. The sons are not named. And these 3 names are Hebrew names, so that the Hebrew people understand God is speaking to you through this story. Jemimah means a little dove. Keziah is a word for a flower or a spice that apparently was very expensive. And Keren Hapuk means something that it's in everyday language, it's a makeup item. It's something that you use to decorate yourself. In some ways, these 3 words signify the dove being the family that he lost, this flower or this expensive thing being his wealth that he lost in the beginning, and this wonderful thing that you use to decorate yourself being the health that he lost. Family, wealth, and health are restored to him, but he does something different with it. Verse 15, in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers, unheard of in their society. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children 4 generations, and Job died old and full of days. Job did what the Lord had in his mind. The story of Job gives us an insight into how we must prefer the poor in all our deeds. Preferential option for the poor. Now, in our reading from Hebrews chapter 7, the first 10 chapters of Hebrews, before we get to that famous chapter of the faith and the ancestors of our faith, over there, in these 10 chapters, the writer is trying to convince some people who probably were not wanting to get used to this newfound faith. They said, this is too much, we just prefer to go back to our Jewish system. We want to just go back to Judaism. And he's trying to convince them that Jesus is better than your system. Jesus is better than Moses. And then in these chapters, he says, Jesus is better than your high priests. He in fact says Jesus is the greatest high priest, right? And he convinces them with these arguments. Now, what does a high priest do? We don't have to go very far. In our own cultures, in Hinduism and in our own indigenous religions, there is a high priest who goes into the temple once in a year, especially around the festival, the biggest festival time, and offers sacrifices, and it's part of the Eastern way of religion, right? Closest to us, even among one of our own tribes, the Todas. Now, this I heard when we visited a couple of months ago. In their temple, which is, they have a couple of different forms of temples. One of them is like a steeple. Their high priest in their community goes in and offers sacrifice. Right now, the Toda community is very centered around the buffalo and milk, and therefore once a year, Toda priests perform a sacred ceremony where they purify the space, bless the buffaloes, and conduct milk rituals, and to honor their ancestral deities and spirits. While this is happening, the community around gathers to pray. They chant hymns, they share in a communal feast, celebrating their bond, their heritage, so that they remember their heritage, they remember their past. In similar manner, in Old Testament history as well, we had the high priests who used to go offer for the same reasons, to honor their deities, to remember themselves as a people. Now, while the writer of Hebrews is trying to talk to these people who are wanting to seemingly go away to their old ways, he lifts up two important things, right? He says that this high priest that you are used to needed to go again and again and do this cleansing. Once a year, or even several times in a year, this high priest that you know of needed to go. Why? Because your high priests are human. And they die, and new high priests come, and they have to do the same thing over and over again. But listen, Jesus did this once and for all. Right? So Jesus offered himself up once and for all. And as verse 27 says, unlike the other high priests, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for those of the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. Jesus performed the duty of the high priest like he performed the duty of the kinsman redeemer. Jesus redeemed us, and that act is once for all. What does that mean for us? It means that in our endeavors, we know that Christ is the only mediator. Christ is the only high priest we ever needed. So we don't need to do any form of appeasement to offer remedy for our sins. Now, sin and salvation is an important part of our own faith system, right? We need not work towards holiness if we don't become aware of our sin. Gustavo Gutierrez is a person who passed away recently, somebody that we read a lot in our seminaries. He was a Peruvian indigenous Roman Catholic priest. Now, this was in the 1960s, and he was a well-trained person. He was a priest in the Catholic order. Now, in the 1960s, the Catholic Church had a major reformation. Now, we had the reformations that we talk about in the 16th century that we kind of attune ourselves to. We will also be celebrating Reformation Day on the 31st this week. We'll probably remember that next week as well. But the Roman Catholic Church opened up its doors in some ways to dialoguing with the other churches around the world in terms of theology and how they think in what is called the Second Vatican Council, which happened in the 1960s. Now, so the priests around that time were very, very vigilant and outspoken about the injustice that happened, especially in vulnerable communities like South America, Latin America, as we say. Now, Gutierrez was one of the persons who came up with a book and a writing called A Theology of Liberation. But the story of how he got to that place is pretty interesting. Somebody recollects this as Guterres was once flying to a conference of the World Council of Churches where he was asked to speak. He was given the topic of a theology of development. Okay, he was asked to speak about a theology of development. Now, if you kind of look at world history, 1960s, the European and the West are still in control of the world, also intellectually controlling the world, and they're saying we need to talk about development because a lot of countries need development right now. So we need to focus on developing these countries so that they kind of come up in society. As he's thinking about his lecture and he's flying, he realizes that this is in fact not a time to think about development. We need to talk about liberation. They are still controlling the way we think. We need to think about our own liberation. And from that is born a great theology of liberation that kind of had sparks across the world. In the US around the same time, a theology of black liberation came forth. And in India around the same time, a person named Arvind Nirmal in our UTC came up with towards Shudra theology, which eventually became towards Dalit theology, where an emphasis was laid on preferential option for the poor. Now, why do I say all these things, right? We have these texts in front of us, and most often than not, we are thinking about what it can mean for us, what it can mean for my personal life, for my family life, what it can mean for me to get up and going in life. But the scriptures tell us more than that. The concept of the kinsman redeemer from Job, the concept of Jesus being the high priest for all. That means that Jesus has in his mind the liberation, the freedom of all, that all may come to Jesus. In spite of many of us putting barricades and saying only a few can go to Jesus. With this in mind, when we come to our gospel passage, the healing of blind Bartimaeus, as we say, we give him an adjective, right? We just call him blind Bartimaeus. As you read in verse 46, you will see that he is introduced as Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. The meaning of Timaeus is honor, from the Greek word timao, which is honor. So, son of Timaeus, bar is son. Son of honor, and look at the way Mark is putting this across. The son of honor, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And those traveling with Jesus, probably those who knew him best and kind of looked up to him, said, "Many sternly ordered him to be quiet." But he cried out even more louder, "Son of honor." That is the state of our people that we do not look at most times. Sitting by the road is another phrase for people on the margins. We sometimes really neglect the ones that we really need to be looking after. But here's a great insight from this story. Now, this particular story is found in all three Gospels, but one verse is strikingly missing in Matthew, and Luke. In Mark, in all these, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Synoptic Gospels, several stories are kind of, that's why they're called synoptics, right? They are repeated, but they say it in their own way. Mark, when he writes this story, has one verse which the others don't, which is quite interesting. Verse 49, this is after he calls out again loudly, Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." Of course, that's there. But the second part of that verse, and they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." Now, we don't know if this "they" is probably the disciples or they who kind of sternly told, "Don't come." But this verse is missing in the other two Gospels. It's kind of perhaps because Mark is trying to tell us something here. Now, the last time I preached again was in the beginning verses of this chapter. Remember that story of Jesus blessing little children? It's right at the top, verses 13 to 16. There, when the children come, the disciples sternly say, "Don't let them in." And Jesus gets angry, the passage says, and says, "Do not stop them from coming to me, for the kingdom of God belongs to them." Fast forward a few verses, and there are still some people saying, "Don't bring him to Jesus. Don't bring Bartimaeus, the son of honor, to Jesus." But thank God that there was someone who had a change of mind. And thank God for Mark recording that. And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." There needs to be someone to go and bring them to Jesus. There needs to be someone to go and bring them to Jesus. Like Job, who said in the first verses that we read, "I heard about you, God, but now I see you. I heard about you, God. I thought I could reason my way out with you, but now I see you, and I understand what you're trying to tell me." Like the disciples and how their eyes were open to the grander and broader vision of God, of being the kinsman redeemer, of being the high priest, we in our own ways are called to partner with God's work. Our scriptures in several ways testify to God's preferential option for the poor. And for those of you who are interested, there is a Bible called the Poverty and Justice Bible. You may have come across that. It's published by, I think, about more than 10 years ago. This Bible highlights verses that address issues of poverty, justice, and God's compassion for the marginalized. And from what they found, there are over 2,000 verses that are highlighted. Like the Jesus Words Bible that has Jesus' words highlighted, this Poverty and Justice Bible has verses that highlight God's care and compassion for the poor. And like my socialized mind, I just said care and compassion. But let me be clear in trying to tell you that the preferential option for the poor is a lifestyle that is far different from charity. It is a lifestyle where we constantly put others' needs above our own. And that means not just looking at the streets and being bothered, not just in our cities being bothered when we are at signals and when people come to us, but to even think of the person who we are working with, who we're right next to, even if it's a sibling or a parent, how can I put that person's needs above mine right now? The preferential option for the poor is a call to transform mind and heart. It is a call to disrupt existing patterns, and it is a call to partake in God's vision for the world, which we see coming through our beautiful scriptures. It is a mandate to put the poor and the needy, far and near, on top of the list. Anywhere or anyone, the woman, the widow, the outcast, the out-thought, the foreigner, the slave, the captive, the cornered, the blind, the blinded, the coerced, the cheated, the feeble, the frail. May we look to Jesus to heal our blindness. Dear friends, take heart, get up. Jesus is calling you. May the Lord bless us.